Here at RUSI, we speak to around 8,500 students who are in professional military education every year. 18 staff colleges around the world in everything from a single lecture to a 2-week long work package. And on themes as diverse as Great Pack Competition, the future of alliances, or hybrid warfare, active measures, the deep battle, or the reality of contemporary conflict. We have a special relationship with Ecole de Guerre. In Paris, the students don't have a deeply intensive laid out syllabus which they've got to crack through during that year. They do that work before they get to the college. And as a result, the year they spend in Paris, they look at topics which are designed to exercise their intellect, to extend their idea of concepts of doctrine, to change how they think about great problems. We've been privileged over the past 3 years to set them a series of challenges every year, and in conjunction with the English department there, the students spend their year looking at a selection of topics that we give them and deciding to write a dissertation, thesis on one of those topics. The topics we select aren't necessarily those that are around the big issues of the day. They're not even necessarily over the big issues over the next 2 to 3 years. But they are issues and challenges that we think need looking at. They're issues that might extend to 20 or 30 years out. They're conceptual and they're designed to stretch them intellectually, to bring something else to bear as they go into the next parts of their careers. Now, normally, at the culmination of their presentations, at the end of their academic year, the students present their findings and their paper to a panel who then challenge them, question them, and generally dig into some of the detail that sits behind it to really push them and challenge some of the debating skills. And again, they do this in English. What's even better is that we found that we have the support of both Vice Chiefs of Defence Staff from the UK and France who make their way to London to RUSI and join these sessions, each of which has been fascinating, challenging and insightful. This year, of course, that wasn't possible. It wasn't possible for the students to come to London to present or to bring people into a big room to do the challenge sessions. So we did it virtually. And we weren't able to bring a whole variety of others to come and view what they saw. So instead, we did it virtually. And the attached presentations that you can see in the following clips are the findings of the students and their papers. The students are really to be congratulated for what they have delivered. It's quite astounding not only that they've achieved this in a year, but in a second language and delivered a paper as well as a compelling and good presentation at the end of it. The whole range of topics that we gave them for the last year were everything from the reliance on logistics, proxies in space, the morphing of cyber and space challenges, contested theatre entry. But perhaps the two most interesting presentations that you'll see were on, firstly, the concept of parity in military terms, and secondly, the changing rules of warfare and what they mean for the future. The students of both of these presentations really excelled themselves, and we're really grateful to the support from Rob Johnson at CCW and numerous others who helped them through what is a difficult intellectual period for them. We really enjoyed working with them and hope you enjoy the presentations that follow. Thanks very much for watching. The first research question that we sent the students was a broad theme around: has the contractorisation of defence gone too far? In explaining this to the students, we used the example of logistics. Military logistics, interestingly, since the pandemic in many countries has been lauded as a great capability, but in reality now is certainly not up to the speed of development of some of its commercial rivals. DHL, Amazon, Hermes, all the other large companies that specialise in from strategic supply to the final mile delivery to the door and integration with the customer have operated in a very different way and have adapted far faster than the military, which in many cases is still using a biro, a pencil, paper, a rubber, or perhaps an Excel spreadsheet. It's interesting that also organisationally, in the face of efficiency, some nations have gone to joint logistics. this idea that individual services can abrogate responsibility for logistics delivery to a central provider. Such a central provider uses rotational people out of each command to fulfill its needs and ensure that priorities are given where they are. But the underlying problem with such organisations is that their responsibility is abrogated to a central organisation where people generally don't have any ownership for the problem beyond the 3 years of their tour. It is something that is worth looking at across the wider picture of contractorisation of defence. Since 1996, governments and militaries have increasingly employed contractors for supply and logistics support. The rise of dedicated service providers for military deployments has reduced costs for militaries, making the use of commercial entities increasingly attractive in the face of financial austerity. From 2003, for a variety of reasons, states have started using private military contractors in tasks from force protection, embassy, FP, and deniable operations. There are few signs this trend is reversing. Indeed, it seems to be a core part of any military mission planning that now envisages a role for private military companies. For some states, these roles have become essential as military expertise in those areas has been deleted under austerity or cutbacks. Yet commercial providers and private military companies operate under a profit mandate, not one that prioritises the mission or the outcomes. These organisations also have a more limited risk appetite than regular military units. Recompense for services for them is often in proportion to the risk the units face. This might have been satisfactory in an area of counter-terrorism or counterinsurgency, but as states refocus on great power competition and high-intensity conflict, there are signs that the contractorisation of defence has perhaps gone too far. The three groups of students who tackled this topic came at it in very different ways. One looked at NATO's POL supply chain and efficiencies that may be made there in a short-termist policy recommendation. A second group looked at a far more ambitious view of whether Europe should develop its own large federalised private military contractor. And finally, the third group looked at outsourcing as a trend. They're all very interesting presentations, but the one on the EU federalised capability is certainly the one that demonstrates the most intellectual curiosity and conceptual interest.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are privileged to kick off this day of presentations. The question asked by RUSI was, has contractorization gone too far? To answer, our team has chosen to focus on the European level, where we believe contractorization has not gone too far and could even go further. So we argue that greater outsourcing in European defense is possible and desirable in many respects by bypassing political deadlocks and bringing new capabilities, and finally making the EU a real power player. We therefore studied what could be the opportunities first, and then what could be the risks before making a series of proposals along those lines. So why thinking about a private solution for European defense? First of all, because the period seems to be favorable. EU defense doesn't really work. Consensus are difficult to find because of different interests, different state strategies, and the rare actions that are conducted are often circumstantial groupings around one particular interest. And yet, there is a need for concrete EU defense because of new threats, because of US disengagement, and so on. At the same time, European countries face the same difficulties with decreasing public support, limited budgets, recruitment tensions. The main opportunity offered by outsourcing is the bypass of national rivalries for leadership and reluctance to risk soldiers' life. A private actor only requires a budget to be voted and the mission can start. The question of troops contribution is also solved, as well as the recruitment by the commitment of foreign nationals. It could also benefit to the European armament industry, providing new outlets and boost joint programs. In terms of business, it would strengthen EU companies facing with British and US competitors of the sector. Finally, it would allow EU to develop a real defense policy in support of national operations like Barkhane, for example. In France and EU, this idea starts to make its way. Ménard-Violet report from the French National Assembly listed in 2012 all the advantages to encourage the emergence of a national giant in the sector. It talks about economic perspective, reconversion of veterans, and so on. Similarly, a study report of the EU Parliament advocates greater recourse to the private sectors for defense issues. Actually, it is already the case for many little missions when national troops are not required or simply when capabilities are not available. And when we look at the evolution of the EU missions, we can see that contractorization is a rising trend.
So it seems that the employment of private military companies could be a source of opportunities. However, recourse to such a solution also involves several risks. The first risk is linked with the difficult acceptation of PMCs. From an ethical point of view, the connections with mercenarism and cases of misconduct weigh very negatively on the perceptions. The Russian PMC Wagner is today a very present player in the Kremlin's power strategy. The legitimacy of such groups acting outside any international mandate raises questions. Furthermore, the use of force calls for ethics and strict discipline, the delegation of which to private actors may pose problems. The Blackwater Company was an emblematic case, fueling much controversy in Iraq. On the legal level then, there is no internationally recognized framework for PMC's activities. The Montreux document, which proposes to establish a code of good conduct, is far from being universally recognized. So regarding international law, using contractors can put a state in default. The outsourcing of defense services then presents a political risk for a state, in particular because it can undermine its sovereignty. First, the use of PMCs leads to the irruption of private interest in defense policies. Moreover, control over capital and governance bodies is necessary to guard against any foreign interference. Eventually, there's a problem with exposing private providers to violence and death. The lynching and display of the bodies of Blackwater contractors in Fallujah had deeply outraged American public opinion to the point of overturning the military campaign. We therefore clearly understand that contracted must be considered within a strict framework to ensure the reliability and compliance of service providers. Lastly, outsourcing poses a major risk of weakening national armies. Much encouraged in the wake of defense cuts, outsourcing has often been presented as a pragmatic means of saving money. The armed forces were invited to focus on their core business and abandon the other tasks to private service providers. This process has thus been widely implemented, particularly in the field of support. However, this model doesn't match with resilience. It must also be kept in mind that any outsourced military capability is to be considered as lost. Rebuilding a lost capability represents huge investments and takes several years. Outsourcing must therefore be based on a logic of complementarity and never as substitution. The contractorization of defense services is therefore a choice that entails a number of risks. Properly assessing these risks is a necessity to set up a relevant framework to take advantage of the very real opportunities linked to the use of PMCs in a perfectly controlled framework.
How can we size the opportunities while mitigating the risks? Our paper features 12 proposals to answer this question. Greater European integration seems unlikely. Therefore, we make these proposals within the current state of the European treaties. These 12 proposals have two goals. Firstly, the EU could have its own intervention capabilities in a time of crisis. Secondly, the EU could strengthen European PMCs in a competitive field. One goal is political and the other is economic, but they go hand in hand. You won't achieve one without the other. Change involves a shift of paradigm. This is our first proposal. The EU can choose PMCs as a first choice solution to provide a wide range of services for EU military missions. To make it possible, we need to import existing concepts and to make it our own. British concepts, such as the contractorisation landscape or the whole defense, could inspire the EU without embrittling national armies. These will help define a doctrine, ensuring interoperability between EU contracted capabilities and national military capabilities. How can we finance the development of the European PMC sector? We could merge European efforts when tendering services. We also need to find ways to give grants. The other important aspect is to help structure the European offer. Legislation and labeling are prerequisites. European operational contracts would allow the EU to develop its own capabilities. The EU could also encourage multi-state coordination and cooperation. The main goal of structuring the sector is to develop leaders, such as Airbus, able to compete on the international market. So, as a conclusion, as French officers, our national army is a priority. Still, we hope the EU becomes a power player to ensure common security for Europe. The private sector is a choice that the EU could make to realize its ambition on condition that it relies on powerful European PMCs.